Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The letters arrived at the Richmond Historical Society in 1962. 3 water-damaged bundles wrapped in oilcloth, discovered during the renovation of a cellar in New Kent County. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the ink faded to a rusty brown on yellowed paper. According to the accompanying note from the construction foreman, the packages had been sealed behind a false wall, alongside a small wooden box containing a silver locket and several buttons made of bone. The society archivist who first examined them noted an unusual scent clinging to the pages, something like dried roses and copper. The letters were signed only with the initials CC, though subsequent research would link them to a widow named Clara Carter, who had inherited the Willow Creek Plantation in 1862. What began as a routine cataloguing of Civil War-era correspondence would soon reveal something far more disturbing, a case that remained buried in academic archives for decades, mentioned only in footnotes of obscure historical journals until 1965, when the documents were mysteriously removed from public access. The Willow Creek Plantation stood 17 miles east of Richmond, nestled between rolling hills and dense Virginia woodlands. The main house was a 3-story federal-style mansion with 6 white columns supporting the front portico, surrounded by 12 worker cabins arranged in a semicircle behind the kitchen gardens. County records indicate the property encompassed 4,200 acres of tobacco fields, stretching to the banks of the Chickahominy River. The estate had been established in 1784 by Jeremiah Carter, who had made his fortune in shipping before turning to agriculture. By 1862, the plantation had passed through 3 generations of Carter men, finally coming under the sole ownership of Clara Carter after her husband Thomas died from typhoid fever in April of that year. The first accounts of unusual activities at Willow Creek began to appear in the summer of 1862. According to a letter written by Reverend James Whitfield of the nearby St. Mary's Parish, he had been summoned to the plantation to discuss funeral arrangements for Thomas Carter, only to find the widow unnaturally composed and primarily concerned with confirming her complete legal authority over the estate and its 37 residents. The Reverend noted that while most widows requested prayer meetings or spiritual guidance, Mrs. Carter instead inquired about the theological concept of dominion and whether Scripture granted property owners complete authority over their holdings. Whitfield wrote to a colleague that he left the meeting feeling a most peculiar unease, as though I had been measured for some purpose I could not discern. What makes the Willow Creek case particularly unsettling is not just the nature of the events that followed, but how thoroughly they were concealed from public knowledge. While neighboring plantations maintained regular communication and social visits, Willow Creek became increasingly isolated after Thomas Carter's death. The record shows Clara Carter cancelled her standing invitations to Richmond Society functions, declined calls from neighboring families, and dismissed the white overseer who had managed the plantation for 14 years, declaring she would handle all matters personally. According to county tax records, she did, however, make one significant change to the estate's operations, selling off most of the female workers to plantations further south, while purchasing additional male workers from farms that were struggling financially as the Civil War intensified. By autumn of 1862, Willow Creek maintained a population that was highly unusual for plantations of that era. 34 male workers between the ages of 20 and 35 years, and only 3 older women who served in the main house. The records indicate Clara Carter personally selected each new acquisition, sometimes traveling as far as 80 miles to inspect potential transfers. A notation in the ledger of labor trader Wilbur Hammond observes that Mrs. Carter was exceedingly particular about physical condition, rejecting several sound workers in favor of others despite the higher cost. The sole surviving account from someone inside Willow Creek during this period comes from Ezekiel Johnson, one of the 3 house servants who managed to leave in December of 1862. His testimony, recorded by a Union Army officer in 1865 and preserved in military archives, describes how the normal operation of the plantation began to change in subtle ways after Thomas Carter's death. The field workers were required to follow unusual daily routines upon returning from the tobacco fields, practices uncommon for the time, and were issued new clothing of finer quality than typically provided. More concerning were Johnson's descriptions of the selection nights that apparently occurred every second Sunday, when Clara Carter would summon all the men to the front lawn of the main house after dark. According to Johnson's account, the men would be arranged in a line while Mrs. Carter, sometimes accompanied by another woman whose face remained veiled, would walk slowly before them, examining each man closely by lantern light. 1 or 2 would then be chosen to perform special duties in the main house for the week, while the others returned to their cabins. Those selected were not seen by the other workers until the following Sunday, when they would reappear at the next selection. Johnson noted that the men who returned from the main house never spoke of what occurred there, but appeared increasingly withdrawn and would stare at nothing for long hours while working the fields. Some developed a peculiar behavior, a repeated touching of the throat that spread among those who had served in the house. The community's suspicions about Willow Creek might have remained mere whispers had it not been for the events of January 1863. A severe winter storm struck the region, with heavy snowfall isolating many rural properties for weeks. When the roads finally cleared in early February, a merchant delivering supplies to Willow Creek reported that he found the main gate locked and no response to his calls. Concerned, he notified the county sheriff, who organized a small party to investigate. What they discovered would be documented in a report that was promptly classified and filed away, only to resurface during a courthouse inventory in 1967. Sheriff William Tanner and 4 deputies approached the main house on February 9, 1863, finding the plantation eerily silent, despite it being midday, when fieldwork should have been underway. The smokehouse chimneys were cold, and no livestock could be seen in the near pastures. After receiving no response to repeated knocking, they forced entry through a side door. The sheriff's report describes the interior as meticulously maintained, yet devoid of normal signs of habitation. The formal dining room contained an elaborate table setting for 12, with fine china and crystal glasses filled with wine that had evaporated to a dark residue. Candles in silver holders had burned down to stubs. The most disturbing discovery came when the search party reached the 3rd floor of the main house. According to the heavily redacted report, they found a large circular room that appeared to have been created by removing the walls between 3 bedrooms. The space contained 12 chairs arranged in a circle, each draped with a white cloth bearing unusual stains. In the center stood a wooden platform raised approximately 18 inches from the floor, with unusual fixtures that the report described in vague terms. The platform was marked with symbols that none of the search party could identify, though a consulting expert from Richmond College would later suggest they represented an amalgamation of West African religious imagery and corrupted Christian iconography. Of Clara Carter and the 37 people who had lived and worked at Willow Creek, no trace was found. The worker cabins stood empty, beds neatly made, personal possessions still in place. A pot of stew sitting in the communal kitchen had rotted, suggesting the disappearance had occurred at least 2 weeks prior. The only potential clue was discovered in Clara Carter's bedroom, a leather-bound journal containing entries that stopped abruptly on January 17th. The final entry read simply, "The ceremony will be complete tonight. I have prepared for 3 months, and now the conjunction of the stars is right. What was promised shall be delivered." The investigation that followed yielded few answers. Neighboring plantations reported no unusual visitors or activities at Willow Creek in the weeks before the disappearances. A thorough search of the surrounding woods and dragging of nearby pond revealed nothing. The case might have attracted wider attention had it not coincided with a major Confederate military campaign that dominated local concerns. Within weeks, the abandoned plantation was looted by deserters from both armies, and by spring, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main house entirely, leaving only the brick chimneys standing. The story of Clara Carter and Willow Creek Plantation might have been lost to history entirely, if not for the discovery of those water-stained letters in 1962. The correspondence, primarily between Clara and a woman identified only as M in New Orleans, revealed dimensions of the case that transformed it from a mysterious disappearance to something far more disturbing. According to scholars who examined the letters before their removal from public access, they detailed Clara Carter's involvement with what appeared to be a small, secretive group of wealthy Southern women who practiced what they called the old religion, a system of beliefs that combined elements of European occultism with rituals allegedly learned from Caribbean traditions. In one letter dated September 1862, Clara wrote, "I have begun the preparations, as you instructed. The men have been selected according to the criteria, youth, strength, and the specific measurements you outlined. I have dismissed Overseer Phillips, as his Christian sensibilities would never permit what must be done. The circle now numbers 11, with myself as the 12th. 3 have proven particularly receptive to the procedures and have progressed to the second level of preparation." Historical researcher Marianne Woodward, who spent 3 months studying the letters in early 1963 before their sudden reclassification, published a single academic paper suggesting that Clara Carter had been inducted into a group that practiced a form of esoteric ritual, where wealthy women used their social position to subvert the typical power structures of Southern society. We await only your arrival to begin the ceremonial practices. Another fragment, dated November, mentioned that the men demonstrate the expected resistance at first, but the tincture you provided renders them more compliant. Woodward's paper was rejected by 3 historical journals before being published in an obscure anthropological quarterly, where it attracted little attention. 6 months later, Woodward accepted a teaching position in Switzerland and never returned to the subject. The final piece of the Willow Creek mystery emerged in 1968, when construction of a highway bypass 17 miles southeast of Richmond uncovered a site containing the remains of 34 adult males. According to the limited forensic examination conducted before the site was hastily paved over, the remains had been arranged in an unusual formation that investigators found difficult to explain. At the center of the arrangement was another body, identified by dental records as Clara Carter. The official report listed the cause of death as undetermined, though unofficial notes from the county medical examiner mentioned unusual markings and evidence suggesting they had been preserved in some manner before burial. Perhaps most disturbing was the examiner's observation that all 34 male remains had been positioned in a distinctive manner that appeared deliberate and ceremonial in nature. The case was officially closed in 1969, with the deaths attributed to unknown natural causes, possibly disease. The discovered remains were removed to an unmarked section of Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. No descendants of the Carter family came forward to claim Clara's remains, and records indicate that the plantation land was eventually sold at auction to cover unpaid taxes. Today, a suburban development stands where Willow Creek once operated, with no historical marker to indicate what occurred there. The only physical reminder of the estate is a small collection of artifacts housed in the basement archives of the Virginia Historical Society. A silver locket containing a miniature portrait of a severe-looking woman with pale eyes, 3 bone buttons, and a single page from Clara Carter's journal, the rest having been destroyed in a storage fire in 1972. Historians and folklorists have offered various explanations for the events at Willow Creek. Some suggest that Clara Carter, suddenly freed from the constraints of marriage in a society that offered women little autonomy, simply descended into unusual behavior, perhaps influenced by the extreme social stresses of the Civil War. Others point to the letters as evidence of a wider network of secret practices that may have existed among certain circles of the Southern elite, hidden beneath the veneer of Christian propriety. A few researchers have suggested a more mundane explanation, that Clara Carter and her workers simply fled the advancing war, perhaps heading west, and that the discovered remains were unrelated to the plantation's inhabitants. What makes the Willow Creek case particularly unsettling is not just the mysterious circumstances of the disappearances, but how effectively the story was suppressed for over a century. When researcher Daniel Freeman attempted to locate the original Carter letters in 1978 for a book on unusual Civil War-era incidents, he was informed they had been transferred to the National Archives in 1965. The National Archives, however, had no record of receiving them. Freeman's subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests were denied on grounds that no such documents existed. His appeal noted that he had photocopies of Marianne Woodward's original research notes referencing the letters, but this evidence was deemed insufficient to establish the existence of the requested materials. The most recent development in the Willow Creek story came in 1984, when an elderly woman in New Orleans contacted the Virginia Historical Society claiming to possess additional correspondence related to Clara Carter. According to the Society's visitor log, a curator traveled to Louisiana to meet with the woman, but no record exists of what was discussed or whether any documents were acquired. The curator, Dr. Thomas Blackwood, retired unexpectedly the following month and moved to Arizona, where he declined all requests for interviews until his death in 1989. Today, the Willow Creek Plantation exists primarily as a footnote in specialized studies of Civil War-era Virginia. The site itself has been completely transformed by suburban development, with no physical evidence remaining of the events that transpired there in the winter of 1862. What happened to Clara Carter and the 34 men under her authority may never be fully understood. The partial evidence that remains, fragmentary letters, a single journal page, a burial site hastily paved over, suggests a story far more complex and disturbing than the official explanation of disease or desertion. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Willow Creek case is how effectively it demonstrates the selective nature of historical memory. Events that contradict the preferred narratives of an era can be systematically erased, not through elaborate conspiracy, but through the simple mechanisms of bureaucracy, misplaced documents, rejected academic papers, and the natural human tendency to rationalize the inexplicable. The story of Clara Carter, a widow who may have used her position to exert unusual influence over those she considered under her authority, who may have been involved in ceremonies that inverted but ultimately reinforced the strict hierarchies of her time, challenges comfortable assumptions about the past. For those who study the darker corners of American history, Willow Creek represents not just an unsolved mystery, but a reminder of how much remains hidden beneath the surface of official narratives. The 34 men who disappeared from the plantation that winter night, whose names were recorded only as property in ledger books that have long since crumbled to dust, represent countless stories that will never be fully told. Their final experiences, whatever they may have been, remain locked in a silence that no historical investigation can penetrate. The land where Willow Creek stood continues its quiet existence. Suburban families build lives there, unaware of what the soil beneath their foundations once witnessed. Occasionally, a homeowner digging a garden will uncover a fragment of handmade brick or a rusted tool, tangible echoes of those who worked that same earth under very different circumstances. But of Clara Carter and her final ceremony, of the circle of chairs on the 3rd floor, and whatever occurred there during the conjunction of stars she so eagerly awaited, no physical trace remains. Only these scattered fragments of documentation, preserved by chance and perhaps by the stubborn resistance of history to remain completely buried, suggest that something happened at Willow Creek Plantation, something that even those who investigated it at the time seemed determined to forget. The historian Marianne Woodward, in the conclusion of her rarely cited paper on the Carter letters, offered perhaps the most fitting epitaph for the case. What occurred at Willow Creek may represent not an aberration, but rather an unusually visible manifestation of the power dynamics that underpinned the entire plantation system, a system in which people were treated as commodities, and the boundaries between ownership of labor and ownership of personhood became fatally blurred. In this light, Clara Carter's apparent ceremonies, whatever their specific nature, can be viewed as merely a more explicit expression of the social structures that were present, if usually unspoken, throughout the society in which she lived. In 1975, a doctoral student named Rebecca Marshall discovered a series of newspaper clippings preserved in the personal collection of former Sheriff William Tanner, while researching law enforcement practices during the Civil War. Among them was a small article from the Richmond Examiner dated March 1863, describing an unusual weather phenomenon reported by travelers along the Old Church Road, the same route that would have led to Willow Creek Plantation. According to 3 separate witnesses, on the night of January 17th, the date of Clara Carter's final journal entry, a column of pale luminescence was observed rising from the direction of the plantation, visible for nearly 20 miles. The newspaper attributed it to electrical disturbances in the atmosphere, noting that similar phenomena had occasionally been reported during severe winter storms. More revealing was a personal note penned by Tanner himself, tucked between the newspaper clippings. It read simply, "What we saw in the upper room defies Christian understanding. The unusual arrangements, the purpose. May God forgive us for not investigating sooner, and may He grant that none discover what is located in the eastern woods. Have agreed with the others that no official record shall contain the full account for the public good and the dignity of the deceased." The note was signed and dated February 10th, 1863. The day after the official search of the plantation. This reference to findings in the eastern woods takes on new significance when cross-referenced with land surveys conducted in the 1950s, which show that the site discovered in 1968 was located approximately 3 miles east of where the Willow Creek property line would have been. This suggests that Sheriff Tanner and his deputies may have known about the location all along, choosing to leave it undisturbed and undocumented for reasons they took to their graves. Equally troubling is the discrepancy between the official county census, which listed 37 workers at Willow Creek in 1862, and the 34 male remains discovered at the site. The location of the 3 female house servants mentioned in Ezekiel Johnson's account remains unknown, Johnson himself disappeared from historical record after giving his testimony to Union officers in 1865. His final documented statement hints at knowledge he was reluctant to share. There be things no man should speak of, not if he hopes for peaceful rest in death. I have told what I can bear to tell. The rest will go with me to Judgment Day, when the Lord must decide whether my silence was cowardice or mercy. The woman identified only as M in Clara Carter's letters presents another unresolved thread. Historical researcher Eliza Montgomery, working in the New Orleans Public Archives in 1992, uncovered property records for a Madeleine Robichaud, a twice-widowed French Quarter resident who owned a small import business specializing in botanical specimens and cultural artifacts from Haiti and Jamaica. According to ship manifests, Robichaud made frequent trips to Caribbean ports between 1857 and 1863, often returning with crates listed simply as ethnological materials. Tax records show she maintained correspondence with at least 6 wealthy widows across the southern states, Clara Carter among them. What's particularly intriguing about Robichaud is that, like Clara Carter and the 34 men of Willow Creek, she vanished abruptly in early 1863. Her French Quarter residence was found abandoned in March of that year. The table set for dinner, a half-finished letter on her writing desk. The final lines read, "The ceremonial circle is nearly complete. Virginia has proven fertile ground, beyond our most ambitious expectations. I depart tomorrow to oversee the culmination. When next I write, we will have transcended." The sentence remains unfinished. New Orleans police records indicate that investigators found a hidden room behind Robichaud's library containing an unusual collection of artifacts: carved wooden figures with movable limbs, jars of preserved botanical specimens labeled in a cipher that was never decoded, and a leather-bound book written in what a consulting linguist identified as a mixture of French, Latin, and Yoruba. The book was confiscated by a Catholic priest who served as chaplain to the police department and subsequently disappeared from record. The investigation concluded that Robichaud had likely fled to avoid Union forces who would soon occupy the city, though this doesn't explain why she would leave behind valuable possessions or an unfinished meal. The connections between Madeleine Robichaud and Clara Carter might have remained merely suggestive if not for the discovery made by architectural historian Frederick Barnes in 2003. While documenting antebellum homes in Louisiana for a preservation project, Barnes photographed the former Robichaud residence, by then converted into a restaurant. During renovation work, contractors removed a section of water-damaged wall, revealing a hidden compartment containing a small wooden box. Inside was a daguerreotype showing 12 women seated in a semicircle, their faces clearly visible. Handwritten on the back were 12 sets of initials and locations, including CC Virginia and MR New Orleans. Most striking was the date noted, December 21st, 1862, less than a month before the disappearances at Willow Creek. Barnes recognized the potential historical significance of the image and contacted the Louisiana Historical Society, but during the confusion following Hurricane Katrina in 2005, both the daguerreotype and his detailed notes were lost. All that survives is a low-quality digital scan showing a group of women in dark dresses, their expressions solemn, with Clara Carter identifiable by comparison to her locket portrait. They appear to be in an ornate parlor, with an unusual circular design visible on the wall behind them. According to Barnes's single published reference to the image, the women's right hands were positioned in identical, unusual gestures. Index and middle fingers extended, while the ring and little fingers were curled against the palm. This tantalizing evidence suggests that whatever occurred at Willow Creek Plantation was not the isolated action of a disturbed widow, but part of a coordinated effort involving women across multiple southern states. The purpose of their gatherings, the nature of the ceremonies performed, and what ultimately happened to its members remain elusive. Equally mysterious is why so much evidence related to the case has been lost, misplaced, or deliberately removed from public access over the decades, whether through bureaucratic neglect, intentional suppression, or simply the erosion of time. In 1998, forensic anthropologist Dr. Elena Vasquez attempted to examine the remains from the burial site, by then relocated to an unmarked section of Hollywood Cemetery. When Vasquez persisted, appealing to the State Historical Commission, she was informed that the precise location of the reburial had been lost due to administrative oversight. Her subsequent research grant application to study the case was denied, with one anonymous reviewer commenting that some historical matters, particularly those with potentially sensitive elements, are better left to rest. Perhaps the most unusual development in the Willow Creek case came in 2010, when a suburban development was planned for a previously wooded area approximately 4 miles south of the original Plantation site. Her request for exhumation was denied by cemetery officials, citing respect for the deceased, despite the unmarked nature of the burial. During the initial survey, ground-penetrating radar identified what appeared to be another archaeological site, this one containing an estimated 12 to 15 distinct formations arranged in a pattern similar to the one discovered in 1968. Before archaeological investigation could begin, however, the development company unexpectedly withdrew its application and sold the land to a private buyer who immediately designated it as a protected woodland preserve, permanently closed to the public. The identity of this buyer, operating through a series of shell companies, has never been conclusively established. Local historian Margaret Holloway, who has spent 20 years researching the Willow Creek case despite institutional resistance, offers perhaps the most intriguing theory about these events. In a self-published monograph circulated among a small community of independent researchers, Holloway suggests that the group described in Clara Carter's letters was not simply a short-lived association that ended with its members, but an organization that potentially continued in some form beyond that time. She points to the pattern of evidence suppression, the mysterious private purchase of the second site, and the curious fact that several researchers who have investigated the case too deeply, including Marianne Woodward, Daniel Freeman, and Thomas Blackwood, either abandoned their work abruptly or encountered unusual obstacles. What we're seeing with the Willow Creek case is not just the difficulty of historical research, Holloway writes, but active intervention to control the narrative. The question we should be asking is not just what happened in 1862, but who benefits from keeping those events obscured today. What legacy of Clara Carter's circle might still be operating in the shadows of power? Holloway's theories might be dismissed as speculative thinking if not for one final, verifiable piece of evidence. In 2015, during a digitization project at the University of Virginia's Special Collections, a technician discovered a previously uncatalogued folder containing a single sheet of paper that appears to have been torn from Clara Carter's missing journal. The page, dated January 16, 1863, the day before her final recorded entry, contains a passage that casts the entire case in an even more enigmatic light. M arrived this evening with the final instructions. The men have been prepared according to the sequence, though 2 required additional procedures after attempting to leave the property. The circle of chairs is arranged in the upper room, and the platform has been inscribed with the 64 symbols in the prescribed order. Tomorrow night, when the alignment is complete, the 12 of us will gather for the ceremony. M assures me that what awaits us is beyond ordinary understanding, not an ending as the uninitiated know it, but a transformation. The participants have been selected for their particular qualities, measured and evaluated over these months. Through this process, we will achieve our goal. Through this method, we will ensure continuation. The cycle will not be broken. The authenticity of this page has been verified through handwriting analysis and paper dating. Its implications, however, remain open to interpretation. The references to participants, transformation, and particularly the phrase, "through this method, we will ensure continuation," suggest something far more complex than previously understood. When combined with the arrangement of the site, the missing records of the 12 women, and the recurring pattern of 12 and 34 across the case, it presents a historical puzzle that has defied conventional analysis. Those few academics who have acknowledged the Willow Creek case typically frame it as an example of the extreme psychological pressures of the Civil War era, a time when social structures were collapsing and individuals, particularly those like Clara Carter, who suddenly found themselves in positions of unchecked authority, might act in ways that reflected the broader moral distortions of the slave system itself. This reading, while psychologically plausible, fails to account for the coordinated nature of the activities across multiple states, or the apparent continuation of efforts to obscure the case well into the modern era. What happened at Willow Creek Plantation in the winter of 1862? The most straightforward explanation, that Clara Carter and 11 other wealthy Southern women engaged in some form of unusual ceremonial gathering involving 34 enslaved men, before some unknown event claimed their lives, is disturbing enough. But the fragmented evidence suggests something potentially more complex and unsettling. The careful selection process, the months of preparation, the repeated references to transformation, participants, and continuation. The precise geometric arrangements of the chamber and the site all point to a belief system with a coherent internal logic, a purpose beyond mere eccentricity or psychological breakdown. Today, the land where Willow Creek Plantation once stood is divided among dozens of private homeowners, none of whom know the history beneath their manicured lawns. The original plantation house site is now a small community park featuring a playground and picnic area. No historical marker acknowledges what may have occurred there. The burial site, discovered in 1968, lies beneath the eastbound lanes of Interstate 64, with thousands of cars passing over it daily. The second potential site remains protected behind high fences, marked only with private property signs, its exact location obscured from public maps. Every few years, a new researcher stumbles upon fragments of the Willow Creek story and attempts to piece together a coherent narrative, only to encounter the same pattern of missing documents, institutional resistance, and dead ends that have characterized investigations for over a century. Some abandon their work. Others, like Margaret Holloway, persist on the margins of academic legitimacy, self-publishing their findings to small audiences of specialized researchers. None have managed to bring the full story into mainstream historical consciousness. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Willow Creek case is not what we know, but what remains hidden, and the possibility that this is not by accident, but by design. If Clara Carter's final journal entry is to be believed, she and her 11 associates were not planning an ending, but a beginning. Through this method, we will ensure continuation. The cycle will not be broken. Whatever meaning those words held for the mistress of Willow Creek, they echo across time as both promise and warning. A reminder that some chapters of history resist closure, that some circles, once drawn, are not easily broken. In 2018, a homeowner in the subdivision now covering part of the former Willow Creek property reported an unusual discovery while digging a garden pond in his backyard. Approximately 3 feet below the surface, he uncovered a small silver object that he initially took for a coin. Cleaning revealed it to be a button made of polished bone, with a tiny symbol carved into its surface, a circle containing 12 radiating lines. The homeowner posted a photograph of the artifact on an online forum dedicated to Civil War relics, asking for identification. Within 24 hours, the post was removed by moderators for violation of community guidelines. When other users inquired about the deletion, they received no response. The homeowner, contacted by a local journalist investigating the incident, claimed he had been visited by someone claiming to represent a historical preservation society who offered to purchase the button for an undisclosed sum. He accepted, signed a non-disclosure agreement, and has declined all further comment. For now, the full truth of what happened at Willow Creek Plantation remains elusive, a whisper in the historical record, a shadow that occasionally falls across the carefully constructed narrative of the past. Perhaps that is how it will remain. Or perhaps, as Clara Carter seemed to believe, some cycles are never truly broken, only temporarily suspended, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge once more. In the archives of the Virginia Historical Society, the silver locket containing Clara Carter's portrait remains in its acid-free box, occasionally examined by researchers with the proper credentials and justification. Those who have held it often report an unusual coldness to the metal, regardless of how long it has been in a warm room or hand. The conservation staff have noted another curiosity. Despite regular professional cleaning, the locket consistently develops a thin film of tarnish in a specific pattern, a circle of dark oxidation surrounding the portrait, with 12 evenly spaced lines radiating outward. The senior conservator has stopped trying to prevent it, noting in the condition report that some artifacts seem determined to tell their own stories, in their own time.